Okay, it looks like I am running. Let's get our little opening advert intro on the road here. The land of steampunk and analog devices. As we slide into, don't forget, tortuganwordpress.com. All that stuff there is openly shareable. Freebie, freebie, freebie. PDFs all over the place. Anyway, and again, we are still on that alternate channel. So anybody that's not seeing me pop up, it's because you need to subscribe to the new one on there. Continuing with Titans, the dietary things, which we'll be getting to. And it's also one of our bi-weekly assaults on our dear pal, air quotes, Casey Luskin, and the 800 list. We're getting close to 100 sources that we plowed through of that. So bit by bit, item by item. Anyway, a milestone has been reached in Sarfati and Tay. They're going in on how various critters can switch from herbivorous to carnivorous. This is related to that SINDAT thing that needs to be resolved in their theological frame and is utterly irrelevant. It turns out that it looks like, as we'll be making a point of in Volume 2 of Rocks Were There, carnivory seems to, so it's the things that turn herbivorous are often the surprising variations. But at any rate, most of the sources that they're offering are young Earth creationist material and largely CMI stuff, which means they've now crossed the threshold. They have now cited more creationist literature than they have technical papers. It's a book. And it's highly likely that that is going to continue through the rest of the book. They will be adding on some other little materials. It would be fun to see how much of it they're reprising that's already been cited elsewhere in the book. That's happened frequently in the thing before. Anyway, but they do eventually get to a technical paper that had a kind of peculiar footnoting aspect to it that I'll be putting the information up on. It was referring to a Meehan and two others exploitation of the pseudo-Myrmex acacia mutualism by a predominantly vegetarian jumping spider, which is at the Ecological Society of America annual meeting in 2008. Then a little semicolon, current biology 2009, semicolon, then a link to a creation.com thing from Catchpool on a vegetarian spider. Now, it turns out if only I could track this thing down, there actually was a technical paper in Current Biology on this from 2009. We'll be putting a link up to it in due course. But this paper that was the draft version, apparently it was presented in a couple different venues, because if you look at Catchpool's version of things, he's got a slightly different footnote that has it at a different conference in New York, the other one, and entirely plausible as far as I can tell. But at any rate, it eventually got converted into a relatively short piece in Current Biology. That was the actual piece involved, and it had things on the distribution of the stuff. It was actually quite an intriguing little thing, because they were making a big deal out of the fact that this herbivorous jumping spider is very unusual for jumping spiders. And that, of course, brings up another question as to what work had been done on this in their 13 years between this 2009 thing and S&T's book. And, of course, the other aspect is that it's a Mexican spider, which means, were they on the Ark? How did they get there? There are jumping spiders in the old world, in Eurasia. There's jumping spiders in America. And that whole brings up the whole issue of how many kinds there are. Are they all in the same family? If so, do they all derive from the common ancestor created during Creation Week? All of these would be obvious questions that would be popping up in the young Earth creationist frame. And to no surprise, there's nothing whatsoever on it. They've got I had to look up stuff on the genus and ultimately a higher issue, because it turns out this whole bunch of the jumping spiders is an intriguingly complicated area in terms of their phylogeny. And creationists might pounce on that. Intelligent designers might too, to give the indication that the evolutionists are in disarray. But no, it's because A, there's a hell of a lot of species, 6,000 of them in the Salticid altogether. And they exist often in big blocks where there are relatively few in Eurasia when almost all of them are in the Americas, or a bunch that's largely in Eurasia with very few known in the Americas, a limited fossil record, some examples popping up in amber. And so until you started to get into the genetics, and as these various papers that I'll be putting the links up to go into in some detail, started defining more of the character states, that has been a limitation on there. So turns out quite a few papers have been done by Wayne Madison and with various colleagues over the years. And a chunk of them are available open access. So I'll be doing one, the oldest paper involved, he was doing back in 2003. And I'll be able to put the linkage up onto that. That goes into quite a bit of detail on the biogeography aspect of them, and there's speculations about when they were diverging, et cetera, et cetera. Then he continued to do work on this. There's a 2014 paper that I'll also be putting a analysis up on with one group of people, and it's got a very detailed phylogenetic breakdown of what they're looking at from that point of view. And then another one from 2015 or 20, yes, 2015. Yeah, so this one I'm afraid I don't have the linkage for, but I'll stick the image of it on screen so that you can always look into it if you want. There was also a breakdown. So there's commonalities on a lot of the subgroups, but it's often the branchings as to how they're fitting as you go farther and farther back in time. Then the most recent one in the field is the 2017 paper. That one we again do have a linkage on, and we'll be putting that one on. And that also has a breakdown in terms of the phylogeny that they're trying to sort out as much as they can deal with it. An awful lot of these papers, for those who feel like diving into them, you'll see how many species that there are, and just cataloging all the little character states and all that stuff is just enormous. And so you have to wonder, could a creationist ever get to the point where they were going to make any sense out of this stuff? What character states would they deal off? Would it be the case that they would be doing it just as all the other baraminologists have, parasitizing the systematic work of the standard evolutionists? I think because of the sheer number of invertebrates, particularly the spiders and insects, and plants being another example, that there are just so much data involved that their brains will explode if they try to dive into it much. And then they would bog down in the prospect of trying to figure out how to keep these little kind things. And then they would have to think about how many of them were on the ark, if any, and if so, how did they get to their present distribution? And can they ever work out a plausible post-flood dispersal pattern on these things? Don't hold your breath, kids, that that's ever going to happen. I would contend that it's impossible because their model's wrong. So they're never going to be able to make any of that stuff work. So they're never going to be able to get to that. The best they can do is try to tiptoe around into groups that have relatively few species. So most of the baraminology stuff relates to mammals, which are the small kids on the block compared to reptiles and birds and all that crowd, let alone invertebrates, so that they can kind of parse the data field down. Plus, there's a natural incentive for them to want to be involved in relation to human evolution. So they really have to get that one down because that's the thing that is the obsession of their audience. So you can see the hierarchy of structure as to what gets paid attention to and what doesn't, both in terms of the theological imperative, regardless of what an anti-evolutionist discusses other than humans in the back of their mind is always the idea to keep human beings separately created. And that's true of intelligent design apologetics as much as it is of young Earth creationist and old Earth creationist stuff. So we'll be going into all of that little fun and games in greater detail in volume 2 of the Rocks for there. I'll point out I'm still wading through the exciting world of the cosmology topics, just discussing things on the variations in vacuum energy, and it's really fascinating to see how many abstruse but fascinating science topics don't get bumped into much in the young Earth creationist frame in this cosmological era. There's relatively few people that have any expertise in the area, and they have a different set of axes to grind, to where they're trying to shuffleboard things around to cram everything into the young Earth creationist context. At least an old Earth creationist has a slightly different dynamic to play with, because they're not quibbling over the physics. It's interesting to see there's a small cadre of people in the field in the young Earth creationist area that don't like Einsteinian relativity. They tend to stay on the periphery on that. Harold Slusher is an example of that. Hasn't really done anything notable on it in years. And given the degree to which relativity theory has too much empirical verification for it, and I think it's the same reason why they would be reluctant to tackle the ins and outs of quantum theory, because this computer is working because quantum theory works. So they don't have much of an opportunity on that. Okay, so let me, before we break off into part 2, let me put up my screen share on our patrons. And whoops, what am I doing here? Come on. To remind everybody that I'm most grateful to everybody that has been able to stick through in our perilous economic times, to help the old RJ slog along, and who knows what will be the future, especially if my historical awareness of things is correct and we're about to slam into a 1929 depression condition, which is going to make things very exciting, but can ultimately lead to some really amazing and positive outcomes, in the same way that the 1890s depression ultimately led to a highly progressive movement and trust busting, and formation of an awful lot of the starting of the safety net and issues of labor and the like, and then hit into high gear during the second depression in the 1930s, when the New Deal was going on. Now, one of the problems at the moment is that, unlike both of those periods, you didn't have an effing idiot as president of the United States and a flock of cabinet officials who are both nincompoops and corrupt jerks at all levels. About one of the few examples of somebody that seems to have a functioning brainstem, although boy, he's going to be corroded by the time he's done with this, is Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, because he is slamming up against the fact that mental dementia, Trump is spiraling around so many little drains, and nobody, like the Fuhrer in the Fuhrer bunker in 45, no one's ever going to be able to tell him he's wrong. So that's going to be a much nastier operation. But we warned you all this was going to be happening. And about 40% of Project 2025 specific policies have already been instituted under the Trump administration. So much for that notion that, well, I don't know anything about Project 2025, Trump said, which is probably true because he doesn't know anything about anything. But his enablers, Heritage Foundation and Vought and all these other crowd, they certainly knew about it and were ready with a whole slew of little things that he would be able to put his little earthquake blob signature, Richter scale mark on it from day one. Of course, it's slamming into the courts, and we've got ups and downs and ins and outs, and it's going to be very exciting. But it's going to alter the dynamic when we hit by the end of the year, when more shit is hitting more fans than the Trumpistas really have thought about. So, sorry about the political rant, but nonetheless, it's a thing. Next week, I'll also be putting a little material on Dan Farina did a scathing breakdown of something that also emanated from the Trump administration. Their claims about the transgender mice claim that was made by idiot Trump in his address to Congress, and trailing the little source base back to where he was getting this information from and how misrepresenting it was. So I'll be discussing that as a little side topic. It's going to be a matter that's going to come up eventually when Jackson and I hit our book on conspiracy thinking, because all the anti-vaxxer crap and all of that stuff and transphobia are topics that will be dealt with in that work. So it's got some future elements on it. But anyway, it'll also be a reminder that the same form of daisy chain pseudo-scholarship that you see in flat earthers or young earth creationists that I've been documenting for umpteen years on this channel is exactly what we're seeing in the Trump administration. There's not a dime's worth of difference. They latch on to something which they've never bothered to fact check and simply repeat it. But instead, we've actually got some stuff, and it's that you can track down all the way up to the White House. So it's a pathetic thing to have happen, but don't blame me. I voted for Harris. Okay. Now on to our exciting part 2, which relates to our ongoing assault on the Luskin file. When I encounter this material, I try to link up with related topic matters. And if they are bringing up a particular topic, I want to see, do they bring it up in some of these other papers? Is there clusters of stuff? And this is the one where I happen to have papers that discuss the regulation of the female germ cell oocytes in various mammals. 3 newer papers and 2 older ones. And all of them, fortunately, are available in open access, and an extra one that they did not cite. And I'll be explaining why, and I bet you can anticipate why. Because the theodicy problem keeps cropping up on the sidebars. And so sometimes Luskin Company will go right off the diving board and cite a work that directly relates to theodicy. Other times they kind of tiptoe around it, so the paper itself doesn't do that, but the connections do. So anyway, the oldest paper, Peaston, is from 2004. It's suggesting a role for some endogenous retroviruses in mice. And then a pair of 2008 papers continued that theme. Watanabe et al., which explores whether the activity is species specific, and Tam et al., which the Luskin list double dips on their thing. They explicitly were citing it later on, the same paper, in a different context. They haven't done that too much so far, but it's a thing that pops up. And when I do my little text search and that to track down on thing, that's when I discovered it. But, they have a slightly different wording for the thing, but it's exactly the same paper popping up in 2 different spots. Anyway, what they did not, of course, there's no annotations or anything at all on the Luskin list. So they would not have maybe noticed that the paper was explicitly noting, quote, a role for a subset of mammalian pseudogenes, unquote, which is a tacit reflection of the fact that not all pseudogenes are involved in whatever it is they're studying relating to oocytes and endogenous retroviruses, which then puts us right back to the issue of, is any of their papers explicitly buttressing the contention that anywhere near 50% of the air quotes junk DNA is actually doing anything? And so far, item by item, paper by paper, nope, we're not finding that. We're retreading the same issue that we have already, that Dan Stern Cardinale called attention to, which is that if you go category by category, you've got a few percentage points, which involves a lot of examples, oodles of them, but it's still a tiny proportion of the whole junk DNA material. And as we know from Casey Luskin's chit chat with Dan Stern Cardinale, there was no Luskin was clearly not sufficiently up on the field to be able to make the case that there was a solid amount. He had to be pressed into a corner before he would even express an opinion, where he was drawing it down to only maybe 50%, which means he was just guessing on the fly. This is not grounded on a meticulous element. I'm not entirely sure even that Luskin and others have actually paid too much attention to this vomit of papers in this 800 list. They're just pulling stuff over, because remember, they're not in alphabetical order. All they have done is lump them in according to categories, signs and long-term repeats, etc., etc. A big section on ALUs, which is the one that we're plowing through at the moment. Most of the papers seem to be involved in that category. But I think they were simply thinking that no one would be so annoying as to actually try to go through every single bloody one of these things to find out whether or not it supports their position. Au contraire. So I'm having fun doing it, and it's going to be an awful long time before we're all the way through them all. But I will do it, every single bloody one of them. And then we'll have an absolute number, which I suspect will end up one iffy example that we encountered very early, remember, in the series, that if you read the wording very liberally, you might leave open the doorway that they might have thought that there was an awful lot of junk DNA that was actually functional, but that's the best you can do. That's the most they can pull off. And apart from waving in code, which people other than Luskin as well do, they just seem enamored of this thing enormously. It's especially amusing in debates. I've seen things with Dan and Jackson and others where some creationists will try to spring the encode example on them as though no one's ever heard of that before, and they think they've got their little secret. Ooh, wow! And Dan and Jackson will drop the boom on them because, oh, we already know about this. And what's revealing is that the people who bring this thing up are not aware of the follow-up work, which indicated that the original 2012 stuff was not as solid as it was shown, and they had to backpedal. So this is a fascinating little phenomenon that goes on here. Anyway, so we've got these 2004 and the 2008 papers. Now, that TAM paper has been cited by other examples before even this, in addition to it being double-dipped on the 800 list. And so it turns out that there's some follow-up work relevant to this point that is not on their list. And it's a paper from PNAS in 2011 by Wen et al., which is observing how the pseudogene-derived RNA originates in a unicellular eukaryote, a parasite trypanosoma, offering insights into how pseudogenes can do the same in organisms like mice without any designer involved. So there's a natural process whereby that pseudogenes can become occasionally general RNA derivatives. And the fact that they had this in an example from a eukaryote was a novel feature on that allows them to get insights that they wouldn't have in relation to the more complicated multicellular organisms that we deal with. Now, remember, this is a parasite. And so if any creationist tried to use this, if Luskin and company tried to field this, they would have to deal with the fact that this would seem that there has been RNA, ALU, retrotransposon usage to help a parasitical organism be a parasite. That's creepy. So they're stuck on that very issue. It's really difficult to find any of these topics where at least 50% of them are ones that are bumping into the theodicy issue. Although the actual technicals that I've listed in my thing so far, we've encountered about a third of them that trip over the theodicy matter. But if you step a little farther, like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, most of these things will pop up into larger contexts. Anyway, then we got a couple papers from the 21st century, the last two that we'll be dealing with, that Luskin and company dealt with, that furthermore resolve and clarify the point that I've been trying to make. There's a 2021 paper from Yan et al. On the epigenetics in human oocytes. Not talking mice anymore, and how they differ from their mouse counterparts. And along the way, they allude to the low methylation levels pertaining to the ALUs in the DNA of both mice. And they're talking about around 900 examples there, and humans about 3,000 examples, and suggest they may, quote, serve as cis-regulatory elements, unquote, pre-implantation. So again, those numbers, 900 and 3,000, are not trivial, but they're also minuscule compared to the number of retrotransposons that there are. And so ALUs, you've got 1.4 million of them in humans. And the counterpart, that B form, I'm not right off the top of my head how many on there. I seem to think it's something like in the 500,000 range, but I'd have to look. At any rate, that means that we're talking about just a teeny tiny little percentage sliver, well below the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10% varying on topic that Dan Stern Cardinale was presenting in his discussion with Luskin. And so we're not getting anywhere past that. Then a 2022 paper from Yang et al. I thought was particularly amusing because it studies pork oocytes, where apparently porcines do not have a hell of a lot of these things. They encountered two, as in two, non-coding ones that they identified from the some 20,000 transcripts that they studied in various forms. Now, you can have those two doing multiple things in multiple times, but still, you're not talking about a colossal amount of examples there. So clearly it's going to be species specific, and it's going to relate to a variety of different contexts. We'll see how far this little list continues as we plow down through the thing. But again, I'm not holding my breath. I do learn an awful lot about stuff, and it has the advantage then that I can present this information to you. So anybody that bumps into this thing can follow up on their own. Don't have to take my word for it. You can follow it up directly. And if anybody can manage to find an example of things that are going to buttress the intelligent design position that above 50% or even 50% of retrotransposons and the like are actually functional, haven't seen it yet. And I don't think we're ever going to. And yet you still find that junk DNA trope popping up over time, along with soft tissue stuff, which is focused primarily in young Earth creationists. So you got these different categories that we kind of delve into. This has been the work on the cosmology chapter has been an interesting one from a long time ago, because first of all, an awful lot of the technical literature wasn't available directly at all. So I couldn't possibly have done this back in the 1990s or the early 2000s. I wouldn't have been able to try it because I wouldn't be able to find all of the relevant material that I can now. And with assistance like Google and Wikipedia that kind of gives some dives into issues and clarifies stuff and highlights what controversies there are and all the rest. And then the ability to hunt around to see what creationists have brought up topics or not. That allows us to catalog things to get a clearer sense, not only of what the actual technical picture is, but also how much of it or not the young Earth creationists have actually dove into. So even though I'm a lot older, in some respects, I'm a little wiser and I have more toolkit available, even though I am not a physicist. And I am very careful about trying to dive around in the little fiddly bit details. I happen to know some people who know various people in the astrophysics community, and that will want to be getting some input to make sure that I've got a good solid presentation on this stuff. But anyway, that's as we continue on through the work. So let us put up our little advert for rocks. We're roughly half an hour in, so we can go with that. I'm not seeing anybody in the chat room. I think it's probably because an awful lot of people haven't flipped over from the other channel where I had most of my people knocking in. But what can we do? And Peter promises to do a new advert for Volume 2 when that appears. And we'll see also whether we can get some little stir up some fun on, say, Apologia, whether he'll do a little advert show for it, as he did with Volume 1, and also maybe Vice Rhino, Dapper Dino. We'll see all the different things to see how we can spread the thing around once we get our Volume 2 out of the way, where it's juicy stuff filled with lots of material that's right up to date. And just as we were both proud of Volume 1, I'm even prouder of what we're going to come up with Volume 2. And especially for so much of this is going to be diving into the full out, fry your brain stupidity of full young earth creationism. So much of the stuff on the cosmological front and the mythological thing, and people in the Civil War supposedly hunting pterosaurs. I mean, it's just stuff where you're going to be scratching your head and go, holy moly. And when you find out how so many of these things have little niche connections, including to people who bump into the current government of the United States, who have access into power and relations to people, that is just not at all nice at all. Anyway, okay, so we're just about a half hour. We got all our things out of the way. I'm not seeing anybody in the chat, alas and alack. So we will see who puts comments in after we get the show out of the way. We will pull the rug on this